The rhythmic, metronomic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound that felt real. For Alice Griffin, it was both a torment and a lifeline, a constant electronic reminder that her husband, Paul, was still here. He lay utterly still in the center of the bed in the ICU of the Harrison Medical Institute, a place that had become the unwelcome center of her universe. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and something vaguely metallic, a sterile perfume that now clung to her clothes and hair. She had spent 23 days in this chair, watching the slow rise and fall of Paul's chest, a movement dictated not by his own will, but by the hissing ventilator beside him. His face, usually so animated and full of laughter, was a placid, pale mask, the rugged lines softened by the unnatural stillness of the coma. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the back of his hand, careful to avoid the IV line taped there. His skin felt cool, a foreign temperature for a man whose warmth had always been a source of comfort for her. Just last month, they had been dancing in their kitchen to an old soul song on the radio, Paul spinning her around until she was dizzy with laughter, promising her a trip to the coast for their anniversary. Now, the silence between them was a chasm, filled only by the hum and beep of machinery. A sudden shift in the quiet atmosphere of the wing announced their arrival before she even saw them. The soft, expensive clack of heels on linoleum, a waft of overpowering floral perfume cutting through the sterile air. Helen Griffin and her daughter, Lauren Bishop, appeared in the doorway, framed like a portrait of grim duty. Helen, Paul's mother, was a woman sculpted from ice, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her designer pantsuit a crisp, charcoal gray that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Lauren, Paul's sister, was her mother's echo, her expression a practiced mask of somber concern that never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. "Alice, dear," Helen said, her voice a low, smooth murmur that grated on Alice's raw nerves. "Still here, you must be exhausted." It wasn't a question of concern, it was an accusation, a subtle suggestion that Alice's constant presence was somehow a performance. Lauren glided further into the room, her gaze sweeping over the machines before landing on Alice. "Mother's right. You look dreadful. Paul wouldn't want you to neglect yourself like this." Alice offered a tight, weary smile, refusing to take the bait. "I'm fine. I want to be here when he wakes up." The words felt like a prayer on her tongue. Helen's lips thinned into a bloodless line. "When, Alice? Or if? We must be realistic. The doctors are not optimistic." She placed a manicured hand on Paul's arm, a gesture that looked possessive and proprietary. "My son was a man of action, of vitality. He would never, ever want to exist like this." She gestured vaguely at the tubes and wires, her disgust palpable. It was a speech Alice had heard variations of for the past week, a slow, insidious chipping away at her hope. Lauren chimed in, her tone laced with pity. "We're just worried about you, Alice, and about honoring Paul's dignity." Alice felt a familiar surge of anger, hot and sharp, but she pushed it down. Fighting with them would solve nothing. It would only desecrate the fragile peace of this room. "His dignity is intact," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He is alive, and I won't give up on him." Helen and Lauren exchanged a look, a quick shared glance of frustration and condescension that spoke volumes. After another moment of feigned, sorrowful gazes at Paul, they turned and left, their perfume lingering like a toxic cloud. Alice closed her eyes, took a deep, shaky breath, and turned back to her husband. She leaned close, her lips near his ear, turned back to her. "I'm not going anywhere, Paul," she whispered, her hand tightening on his. "I'm right here. Don't you listen to them." "You just fight." The official letter from the Harrison Medical Institute arrived via courier 2 days later, a crisp, intimidating manila envelope that felt heavy with dread in Alice's hands. Her name and address were printed in stark, impersonal font. Inside, the heavy bond paper and formal letterhead confirmed her fears. It was a summons. At the formal request of Mrs. Helen Griffin and Mrs. Lauren Bishop, the hospital's Ethics and Oversight Committee was convening a meeting to review the ongoing care of patient Paul Griffin. Specifically, it was to discuss the validity of Alice's medical power of attorney. The words swam before her eyes. Fitness to make decisions. Patient's previously expressed wishes. Prolonged futile care. It was a declaration of war, cloaked in the sterile language of medical bureaucracy. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. Alice's blood ran cold. This was no longer about passive-aggressive comments in the ICU. This was a formal, calculated attempt to strip her of her rights, and in doing so, sign Paul's death warrant. The fear that had been her constant companion now twisted into a knot of pure panic in her stomach. She was a librarian, a woman who found comfort in the quiet order of books, not the combative theater of a boardroom. The conference room was as cold and imposing as she had imagined. A long mahogany table gleamed under recessed lighting, reflecting the serious faces of the three people who would decide Paul's fate. Dr. Evans, a man in his 60s with a kind but weary face, sat at the head. Flanking him were a stern-faced hospital administrator and a lawyer whose expression was utterly neutral. Helen and Lauren were already seated opposite her, looking poised and prepared. Helen began, her voice a masterclass in controlled grief. She spoke of Paul's love for life, for hiking in the mountains and sailing on the lake. "My son was a force of nature," she said, dabbing a dry eye with a silk handkerchief. "He told me once, years ago, 'Mom, if I ever can't be me, truly me, don't let me linger.' To see him tethered to machines, it's a violation of the very essence of who he was." Lauren picked up the narrative seamlessly, her tone sharp and clinical. "We believe Alice's grief is clouding her judgment. Her refusal to accept the medical prognosis is understandable, but it is not in Paul's best interest. She is prolonging his suffering out of a hope that the medical team has repeatedly told us is unfounded." When it was Alice's turn, her heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands trembled under the table. She had no prepared speech, no legal argument. She only had the truth. She looked directly at Dr. Evans. "I understand what you're hearing," she began, her voice shaky at first, then gaining strength. "You're hearing from a grieving mother and sister. But I am his wife. The night before our wedding, Paul and I were talking, and he got serious. He made me promise that if anything ever happened to either of us, the other would fight. He said, 'Don't you ever let them give up on me, Alice. You're the one who knows I'm a fighter.' He didn't say unless it gets too hard. He didn't say unless the odds are long. He just said, 'Fight.'" She took a breath, her gaze sweeping over Helen and Lauren's stony faces. "I am not prolonging his suffering. I am honoring his wish. I am keeping my promise." She finished, her chest aching with the effort of holding back tears. Dr. Evans listened intently, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mrs. Griffin," he said, his tone professional. "The committee will take all of this under advisement. We will need to review the doctor's latest reports and convene again to make a final determination." Alice left the room feeling as though she had just walked a tightrope over a canyon, with no idea if she had made it to the other side or was about to plummet. The emotional hangover from the committee meeting was profound. Alice sat by Paul's bed, the weight of the hearing pressing down on her, making the air in the room feel heavy and hard to breathe. She had replayed her words and theirs 100 times in her mind. Had she been convincing? Or did she just sound like the hysterical, denial-ridden wife they painted her as? The steady beep of the monitor seemed to mock her, a rhythm without consciousness, a beat without a soul. Exhaustion, deep and bone-weary, finally forced her from the chair. She needed coffee, or just a change of scenery, anything to escape the suffocating quiet of the room for a few minutes. She stepped out into the main corridor of the ICU wing. It was late, and the usual hustle had died down, leaving the hallway long, bright, and unnervingly silent, punctuated only by the distant hum of an ice machine. As she rounded the corner toward the deserted night shift nurses' station, she heard voices. Low, conspiratorial tones. She recognized them instantly. Helen and Lauren. Alice froze, flattening herself against the cool, painted wall, tucking herself into the shadow of a large potted plant. They hadn't seen her. Their backs were to her as they stood near a window overlooking the dark hospital grounds. "I have to admit," Lauren was saying, a note of smug satisfaction in her voice. Her little speech about fighting was almost touching. So pathetic. Helen let out a low, humorless laugh. "She's a fool. She's so wrapped up in her storybook romance, she can't see the truth right in front of her." A cold dread, sharp and immediate, snaked its way up Alice's spine. She held her breath, listening. "She really thinks it was just some random tragic accident," Lauren continued, her voice dripping with contempt. "She has no idea." Then came the words that shattered Alice's world. "That mechanic from the South Side was worth every single penny," Helen said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. But in the echoing quiet of the hall, it was as clear as a gunshot. One clean snip of the brake line. An elegant solution. No fuss, no witnesses, nothing that could ever be traced back to us. A perfect job. The hallway seemed to tilt. The floor felt like it was falling away beneath her feet. Alice pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a gasp that burned in her throat. Nausea churned violently in her stomach. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a cruel twist of fate. It was a plan. They had tried to murder her husband. Her Paul, Lauren scoffed. "She'll sign the papers at the next meeting. She's already cracking. Then Paul's suffering will finally be over. And, more importantly, so will our financial waiting game. The estate will be settled, and we can finally get on with our lives." The casual cruelty, the sheer, unadulterated evil of it, struck Alice with the force of a physical blow. The grief she had been drowning in for weeks was instantly incinerated, replaced by a horror so absolute it felt like ice water flooding her veins. They hadn't come to the hospital out of concern. They had come to admire their handiwork, to ensure their victim didn't inconveniently survive. Every visit, every comment about his dignity, had been a lie designed to manipulate her into finishing the job they had started. Dignity. She shrank back into the shadows, her entire body trembling as she watched them walk away, their crime hanging in the air between them like a poisonous vapor. Alice stumbled back into the sanctuary of Paul's room, her hand still clamped over her mouth. She quietly shut the door, the click of the latch sounding like a thunderclap in the silent space. Her legs gave out, and she slid down the door to the floor, her body shaking with a violence that frightened her. The sterile air she'd been breathing for weeks now felt toxic, contaminated by the truth she'd overheard. A perfect job. Worth every penny. The words echoed in the cavern of her mind, a demonic chorus. They had tried to kill him. Helen, his own mother. Lauren, his sister. The people who should have loved him, protected him. The image of them laughing in the hallway, laughing about his murder attempt, was burned onto the inside of her eyelids. Her first frantic thought was to run, to find a police officer, to scream what she had heard to anyone who would listen. But an even colder realization washed over her immediately after. Who would believe her? It would be the word of a distraught wife against two wealthy, respected pillars of their community. They would deny everything. They would paint her as unhinged, lashing out in her grief, fabricating a wild story to punish them for challenging her. She had no proof, nothing but the terrible knowledge that was now poisoning her from the inside out. She looked over at Paul, so still and vulnerable in the hospital bed, completely unaware of the depth of the betrayal that surrounded him. He was a victim twice over, first of their greed, and now of a system that would likely protect his attackers. A new emotion began to bubble up through the horror and the shock, something hard and sharp and unfamiliar. It was rage, a pure glacial rage that burned away her tears and steadied her trembling hands. They were not going to get away with this. They were not going to stand over his grave, feigning grief, while their bank accounts swelled with the money they'd killed him for. And they were certainly not going to manipulate her into being their unwitting accomplice. She was his wife. She was his protector. And now she would be his avenger. She slowly got to her feet, her movements stiff. Her eyes fell on her smartphone, lying on the small bedside table, its screen dark. It was a simple device she used for calls, texts, and reading the news. But in that moment, she saw it for what it could be, her only weapon. The plan began to form in her mind, desperate and dangerous. She had to get them to say it again. She had to get their confession on record. The thought was terrifying. It would mean facing them, acting, lying. It meant putting herself in the path of two people who had already proven they were capable of murder. But as she looked at Paul's peaceful face, she knew she had no other choice. She picked up the phone, her fingers finding the voice recorder app. She pressed the red button, watching the timer start to count. The quiet hum of the phone felt like the arming of a bomb. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her gut, but now it was overshadowed by a fierce, desperate resolve. The hunt had begun. Alice spent the next 24 hours meticulously planning her performance. Every word, every gesture had to be perfect. She practiced in the reflection of the darkened hospital room window, forcing her shoulders to slump, her eyes to look defeated. She let the genuine exhaustion she felt seep into her expression, twisting it into a convincing mask of despair. She knew she had one chance to get this right. She found them where she knew they would be, holding court in the hospital cafeteria during the mid-afternoon lull. It was public enough that they would feel secure, but the ambient clatter of trays and distant conversations would provide enough cover for their words not to be overheard by anyone but her. And her phone, which was nestled in her coat pocket, its microphone aimed outward, the voice recorder app silently capturing every sound. She approached their table, her steps slow and hesitant. "Helen? Lauren?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. They looked up, their expressions a mixture of surprise and wary triumph. They had been expecting her to break. It was only a matter of time. "Alice," Helen said, her tone softening with predatory sympathy. "Come, sit down, dear." Alice shook her head, remaining standing, a portrait of a broken woman. I can't stay. I just came from a meeting with Dr. Evans. He was just updating me." She let her voice crack, squeezing her eyes shut as if fighting back tears. "He said there's no change, no brain activity, nothing." This was the first lie, and it felt like swallowing glass, but she pushed on. I think you were right." Lauren and Helen exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance of victory. "I can't keep doing this to him," Alice continued, her voice thick with manufactured grief. "It's selfish. I'm thinking of telling the committee I agree with you. I'm ready to sign the papers." Helen reached across the table and patted her hand. It took all of Alice's willpower not to recoil. "Oh, my dear child," Helen cooed. "You're being so brave. It's the right decision. You're finally seeing reason. It's what Paul would want." This was her moment. Alice looked up, her eyes wide and pleading. "I know, it's just so hard. The accident feels so random, so deeply unfair. His brakes. The mechanic had just checked them over the month before. How could they fail like that?" The bait was laid. She watched as Lauren's arrogance overrode her caution. The younger woman scoffed, leaning back in her chair with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Please, Alice, some things are just meant to be. Honestly, you should see it as a blessing. A quick end on the highway is far better than this slow, pathetic fade. We just helped fade along a little." The confirmation was so blatant, so cold, it almost made Alice gasp. Helen, emboldened by her daughter's candor and Alice's apparent defeat, added the final damning detail. "That mechanic assured us it would be completely untraceable," she said in a low, confidential tone, as if sharing a helpful secret. "A simple mechanical failure. No one would ever know. It's cleaner this way for everyone." Alice stared at them, letting a single, real tear trace a path down her cheek. It was a tear of fury. She pulled her hand back. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked. I need to go." She turned and walked away, her heart hammering against her ribs not with fear, but with the savage, triumphant certainty that she had them. She had their evil, their arrogance, and their confession, all captured in the palm of her hand. The final meeting of the Ethics and Oversight Committee felt like the last act of a grim play. The conference room was just as cold, the mahogany table just as polished. Dr. Evans, the administrator, and the hospital's lawyer were all seated, their faces etched with professional gravity. Helen and Lauren were already there, exuding an air of serene confidence. They were dressed in somber, expensive clothes, their masks of grief worn to perfection. They believed the war was won. Helen delivered a short, eloquent speech, praising Alice for her courage and acceptance in finally coming to the only compassionate conclusion. She spoke of setting Paul's spirit free, her voice catching with theatrical emotion. "We are all in agreement now," she concluded, casting a benevolent smile toward Alice. "It is time to let my beloved son go. with the dignity he so richly deserves. The room was silent. All eyes turned to Alice. "Mrs. Griffin, Dr. Evans prompted gently. "The floor is yours. Do you have anything you wish to add?" Alice stood up, her movements calm and deliberate. The terrified woman from the first meeting was gone, replaced by someone they did not recognize. Her face was a placid mask, but her eyes held a fire they couldn't comprehend. "Yes, Dr. Evans, I do," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that startled everyone. "I have something I believe the entire committee, and soon the police, will need to hear." Before anyone could react, she placed her smartphone on the center of the gleaming table. With a steady finger, she pressed play. The recording began. First, the ambient noise of the cafeteria, then her own, broken-sounding voice saying, I think you were right." Then came the other voices, clear and unmistakable in the silent room. Helen, cooing about her bravery. And then Lauren, her tone dripping with contempt. "Honestly, you should see it as a blessing. A quick end on the highway is far better than this slow, pathetic fade. We just helped fade along a little." A collective sharp intake of breath came from the committee members. Dr. Evans's face hardened, his eyes locking on Helen and Lauren. The administrator's jaw went slack. The recording continued, playing Helen's damning confirmation. "That mechanic assured us it would be completely untraceable, a simple, mechanical failure. No one would ever know. It's cleaner this way for everyone." The sound of Helen's own voice, confessing to the attempted murder of her son, filled the air. When the recording finished, the silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and horrified. It was broken by a strangled shriek. "No!" Helen screamed, her face contorting from a mask of grief into one of purple, reptilian rage. She lunged across the table, her manicured nails reaching for the phone. "That's a lie! It's a fake! She's a manipulative witch! She tricked us!" Lauren was ashen, frozen in her chair, her mask of composure shattered into a million pieces, revealing the terrified ghoul beneath. The room descended into chaos as Helen began to sob and scream accusations, her perfect facade crumbling to reveal the monster within. The conference room devolved into a vortex of chaos. Helen Griffin was on her feet, pointing a trembling finger at Alice, her voice a hysterical screech. "She edited it! She's trying to frame us!" Lauren, white as a sheet, was trying to pull her mother back into her seat, whispering, "Mother, stop! Just stop!" Dr. Evans, his face a thunderous mask of fury and disgust, stood up, his voice booming over the noise. "Mrs. Griffin, that is enough." The hospital's lawyer was already on his own phone, speaking in low, urgent tones, his back to the room. He was calling security. But just as the scene reached its crescendo of screaming and accusations, the heavy conference room door burst open with such force that it slammed against the interior wall. A nurse stood in the doorway, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with an emotion that was neither fear nor anger. She was a familiar face from the ICU, a young woman named Maria. She paid no attention to Helen's tirade or the stunned faces of the committee. Her frantic gaze scanned the room and locked onto the one person who mattered. "Mrs. Griffin!" she called out, her voice cutting through the pandemonium like a siren. "You need to come right now." Alice's heart seized in her chest. A cold wave of fear washed over her, momentarily eclipsing her triumph. "Oh God, no, not now. He's gone." "What is it?" she managed to ask, her voice a choked whisper. "What's happened to him?" The nurse took a step into the room, her expression shifting from urgency to one of pure, unadulterated astonishment. A disbelieving smile broke across her face. "It's your husband," she said, the words echoing in the suddenly silent room. "The monitors, they all started going crazy. We thought, but it wasn't that." She took a deep, shaky breath, her eyes shining. "Mrs. Griffin, he's waking up. He's opening his eyes." For a moment the world stopped. Alice stared at the nurse, unable to process the words. Waking up. The two words she had prayed for, begged for, lived for nearly a month. A sob escaped her, a sound of such profound relief that it seemed to be wrenched from her very soul. The camera of the mind would have panned from Alice's face, streaked with sudden tears of joy, to the faces of her accusers. Helen's screaming had stopped, her mouth hanging open in slack-jawed horror. Lauren looked as if she had been turned to stone, hanging open in their perfect crime, the one they had confessed to just moments before, had just failed in the most spectacular way possible. Their victim was waking up. He was going to live. And as if on cue, from the hallway outside, a new sound began to grow louder and more insistent, the approaching wail of police sirens. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The arrival of the Harrison Medical Institute's security team, followed moments later by 2 uniformed police officers, put an end to the chaos. The recording from Alice's phone was handed over, sealed in an evidence bag. Helen Griffin, who had collapsed into a sputtering, incoherent mess, and Lauren Bishop, who was catatonic with shock, were escorted from the conference room. Their arrests in the gleaming, sterile lobby for conspiracy to commit murder and aggravated assault became an instant, hushed legend among the hospital staff. Their downfall was as public as it was absolute. Alice, however, was already gone, running through the corridors, her heart pounding with a hope so fierce it hurt. The scene in Paul's room was one of quiet, miraculous transformation. The frantic alarms were silenced, replaced by the same steady beeping as before, only now it sounded like a song. Paul's eyes were open. They were hazy and unfocused, clouded by weeks of darkness, but they were open, and they were moving, slowly taking in the room before finally settling on her. Alice rushed to his side, her hands covering her mouth as she choked back tears. A nurse was gently checking his vitals, a doctor shining a small light into his eyes. He was still intubated, unable to speak, but as Alice took his hand, his fingers twitched and then weakly, miraculously, squeezed hers. It was a message. I'm here. I see you. In that single simple pressure, she felt the return of everything she thought she had lost. Leaning close, she whispered to him, the words tumbling out in a torrent of relief and love. Paul. Oh my God. Paul, you're back. You're back. I'm here. You're safe now. They can't hurt you ever again. A few weeks later, the world had shifted on its axis. A local news report playing on the television in the hospital's rehabilitation lounge showed mugshots of Helen and Lauren, their faces pale and stripped of all their former arrogance. They had been denied bail. The mechanic they hired, facing his own set of charges, had confessed completely, corroborating every detail on Alice's recording. The Griffin family name was now synonymous with a scandal of Shakespearean proportions, their social and financial ruin total. The final scene of their ordeal played out not in a courtroom or an ICU, but in the hospital's sun-drenched rooftop garden. Paul was in a wheelchair, still weak but gaining strength every day. The tracheotomy tube was gone, his voice a raspy but determined whisper. He looked out over the city, the afternoon sun warming his face. Alice stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. He turned his head, his eyes now clear and full of a profound, weary wisdom, meeting hers. They told me what you did, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. All of it. The meeting. The recording? He reached up and took her hand, his grip much stronger now. You saved me, Alice. She shook her head, tears welling. You saved yourself, Paul. You fought. No, he insisted, his gaze intense. I was lost in the dark. You were my lighthouse. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. She leaned down, and he met her halfway, their kiss a promise of a future they had earned through fire and betrayal. It was not a fairy tale ending, but something far more precious, a real and hard-won new beginning, a dawn that was finally and truly their own.